Thank you for coming to the Life Science Nation RESI redefining early stage investments. The panel is about diagnostics this morning, and we have some really outstanding panelists from all around the United States. Um, I'm going to just introduce myself as the moderator. I'm Nola Masterson. I'm investing out of a fund called Portfolia Femtech Fund. We look for deals that are in the tech space that are geared toward women and women's health needs. We're on our second fund already, and we've had some very exciting investments. And my panel is also investing in areas that are exciting. I'm going to let each panelist tell you a little bit about what they're investing in, and then we'll get into the meat of the conference agenda, which will be what's happening today in diagnostics. So do you want to start us off, Jenny?
Sure, happy to, Nola. Thanks so much. And thanks for the organizers for pulling us together. It's always great to actually have a chance to talk about diagnostics and put the spotlight on it. My name is Jenny Rook. I'm the founder and managing director of Genoa Ventures. We're based in San Francisco. We focus on investments in early stage companies that are innovating at the convergence of biology and technology. So I started Genoa to be a firm that really looks at companies that are neither just bio or just tech, but truly the integration of the two, and we seek to be that as well. We look at applications of biology and technology across industry. So that includes research tools and diagnostics, that kind of deep technology that can advance science there, as well as applications outside of human healthcare like agriculture and industrial bio. We tend to lead first institutional rounds, so lead, seed, and A. We're also happy to join later stage rounds as a value add follow.
And Josh.
Great. Well, thank you, Nola. Thank you to LSI and for having this panel today. So I'm Josh Phillips. I'm a managing partner with Catalyst Health Ventures. We are a Boston-based early stage firm. We focus on med tech, which we define as medical devices. We have done some diagnostic and research tools and instrumentation, and also on molecular and other diagnostic opportunities. Like Jenny, we are a lead investor in the early stage space. We do both seed deals, Series A, Series B, and we are investing now out of our third fund. So what we're looking for are things that are going to have a real, clear, meaningful impact on outcomes. So whether it's a therapeutic device, whether it's a diagnostic that is going to enable better treatment and better outcomes, that's really where we focus. And so no specific disease states, but it's generally devices, diagnostics, and potentially some infrastructure.
Stephen, J&J.
Hi, well, good to see everyone. Great to be part of the panel. Thanks, Nola. Thanks for the organizers. Great to be here. I love diagnostics, first of all. I think it's a huge part of healthcare, and I'm so excited to be here. So I'm part of Johnson & Johnson Innovation, which is our corporate innovation group at Johnson & Johnson. And as most of you know, we have three sectors. We have our medical devices, we have our consumer health, we have our pharmaceutical sectors, and then we have cross-sector initiatives that go across all three. And so J&J Innovation really set up to be a red door, as we jokingly say, and a way for the outside to engage with the inside. And how do we get ideas from the outside inside into our pipeline? And we have a huge recognition that the best ideas come from the outside. They're happening on the outside, and we want to be part of that, and we want to be part of the conversation. So that's really how we're set up. And I think my role specifically is I run the J Labs initiative across the Northeast part of the US, which is Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. And it's 5 sites, and I have over 100 companies right now that we're incubating, that a fair number of them are diagnostics and they're therapeutics and everything else. And so we're looking for companies that are basically not quite ready for a big deal yet, but something that's still incubating, that's disruptive, that's transformational, that can make its way into our pipeline. And those are the companies that we really target, try to incubate, and try to advance them to be the best version of themselves, and hopefully get something very bigger with J&J, and get great ideas to our patients and consumers.
Steve, do people that you invest in have to come into your incubator, or do you invest outside of incubator companies?
Yeah, so Johnson & Johnson Innovation set up with a number of different capabilities. And we have our venture capital group that is set up to do more Series B, C type of funding. We are typically before that, and our goal is to get companies to a point where they actually, our JJDC can invest in these type of companies. So that's really where we play, is getting the ideas in newly formed companies that are seed or Series A and getting them moving down the pipeline.
Fantastic. Jenny, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the companies that are in your portfolio and what's happened with them, good, bad, and ugly?
Sure, I'm happy to give a few examples. We have in our first fund actually 3 companies that are on the translational to clinical diagnostic spectrum. I'll mention Interven Biosciences, which is based here in the Bay Area. They're combining mass spectrometry with AI to really get the most insights out of the glycoproteome. So looking at those that modified portion of the proteome with the hypothesis that that's kind of where the business end of biology is happening. It's the, the grooves in the key that really makes proteins fit into the lock. And so the belief that by characterizing the modified proteins, we should have better insights into biology, disease, and diagnostics. So their first asset is actually in ovarian cancer. Speaking of women's health, they're just wrapping up the trial there. For that first diagnostic test, and there's several others coming along in the pipeline for other larger oncology indications as well as outside of oncology. So we're pretty excited about that one. Our most recent investment is in a company called Brainbox Solutions. This is a really interesting example of a multimodal diagnostic where it's a combination of functional tests and blood-based biomarkers licensed out of Johns Hopkins to provide better diagnosis and prognosis of traumatic brain injury or mild concussion, which has a huge unmet need for being able to assess kind of what's going on in the brain after injury and how to most support patients through recovery. And then finally, I'll just mention IonPath, which is a company started by a Stanford pathologist to get more information out of pathology samples to be able to, again, using mass spec as a way to interrogate high-plex proteomics within tissue samples, currently being used by a range of diagnostic and pharma customers in a partnership manner, as well as selling instruments to be able to equip researchers who are doing their own clinical work looking for those next signatures. So that's some examples from our world.
That's music to my ears because 21 years ago, a company I started that used mass spec called Sequenome went public. And I didn't even know when I started the company in '93 how important mass spec would be to the world of genomics, but we kind of laid the foundation with Sequenome. So it just, this is beautiful that it's being used for proteomics in such beautiful ways. Josh, maybe you would like to tell us a little bit about how your portfolio companies are doing.
Sure. So from the diagnostic standpoint, I guess, we've invested across the spectrum of sort of the tool or basic technology and have gravitated more and more to the particular content or the test itself and moved away from that. So our highest profile diagnostic company is called Prognostics. It's a Utah-based company that has developed a proteomic assay to predict preterm birth. And so they're able to predict preterm birth at about 19 weeks of pregnancy, which then enables therapies to be utilized that can actually have an impact on that, either the length of gestation or the health of the baby. So that has a very big impact, and that company is doing quite well. They're in the early commercialization phase. It's a very large market, obviously, here in the United States, and preterm birth is one of the big problems around the world. So what interested us in that company specifically was that prior to this test, there really was no way of assessing a woman's individual risk of delivering preterm. Existing methods are able to identify maybe 10% of those women who will have a preterm delivery. we're now with this test able to get up to the 90% plus in terms of predictivity. And what was really compelling for us is that the economic and clinical value here can be very clearly modeled and understood. So if you were to test every woman in the United States at 19 weeks of pregnancy, and for those who are at high risk, treat them accordingly with basically standard protocols, you can dramatically improve health and outcomes, which can be measured. And so with every one of our companies, that's what we're looking at. Is it's great to have the information, but with that information, can you act upon it, and can you act upon it in a way that both improves the clinical outcomes meaningfully, but also reduces cost to the system? So by reducing the numbers of preterm births or numbers of days in the NICU or having healthier babies, great clinical outcomes and dramatic savings to the healthcare system. So that's an important aspect of what we look at. So that's one company. That's the only active diagnostic company right now in our portfolio. Previously, we had a company called Allegro Diagnostics, which had a gene expression test to diagnose lung cancer. And this was it's now, it was acquired 5-6 years ago, and is actually doing quite well now in the market. But that was a gene expression panel taken from normal airway epithelial cells, not the actual tumor specimen itself or the biopsy specimen, which was able to then predict whether or not that suspected cancer was in fact cancer. So it was able to eliminate a lot of unnecessary biopsies. And that's kind of another aspect that we look for, is access to the suspected tumor. Difficult, potentially dangerous, fraught with side effects. Ovarian cancer is another one. And is there a way then that we can access a sample either remotely or get a proxy for that, or have a better access tool that solves that problem? So Envision was a company we had that developed a catheter that was able to collect cells from the fallopian tubes in the ovaries for early detection of ovarian cancer. It's a device, but it's a diagnostic device. Was acquired by Boston Scientific. Those 3 examples of things that we've done. Historically, we did a genomic analysis platform called Biotrove and a mass spec sample prep system called Biokias. That was actually spun out of Biotrove, but that was a long time ago in a previous portfolio.
Sounds like you got some femtech deals that we'd love to have a look at, Josh. At portfolio.
Yeah, it's an area that we're quite interested in.
Right. And Steve, I know that you talked a little bit about what you do at J&J, but why don't you talk a little bit about what you were looking for in terms of new deals?
Yeah, I think we look at diagnostics, I think of it very broadly, and I hope I'm not too broad, but we look at it from everything from digital diagnostics, digital biomarkers, to some of the things that the other 2 panelists mentioned. So it's a broad kind of set of technologies and solutions. And so typically we're seeing a lot of activity in companion diagnostics. So how do we know when to take what drug at what time and what patients, those type of things. And so, we've been pretty active in a few deals in the lung cancer initiative that we have that goes across 3 of our sectors. And we're looking at a lot of different diagnostics from across, consumer products. Where could we move into the home diagnostic piece? We're seeing a lot more activity now, especially with COVID accelerating this, where, could we do more at the home, which then means could we have more easy to use and inexpensive diagnostics that are measuring a bunch of different things. So you could imagine the future one day where you have that runny nose, that's your symptom, but what's causing it? Is it something that requires an RX? Is it an allergy? Is it a cold? Is it COVID? Is it influenza? Those type of things. So we're seeing technologies in that area that are very interesting. And those could be traditional diagnostics that are been improved. So they'd be lateral flow strips that have been improved with new technology to make them more accurate, to reduce the cost. We're seeing a lot of things that are digital biomarkers. Are there ways to use sound? Are there ways to use, we have one deal, for example, with Janssen with a company called Huma, which is a JLabs company that's looking at voice as a biomarker and actually looking to diagnose things like Alzheimer's from your voice alone. We have, devices that listen for a cough or listen, that'll be a stethoscope, for example, another company that's basically looking at, replacing the stethoscope experience that a doctor would use or at least minimizing errors and kind of using diagnostics to enhance that. We have some cancer companies that are looking at early stage diagnosis. We have, we this year we did a big with, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but with COVID, we did a big partnership with BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And we're looking together with them for diagnostics in certain areas that meet our needs plus meet their needs. And, one example there would be a company called MPOD is looking for a COVID diagnostic. And I think that platform, the platformability of that technology is what we're really interested in. Where could you go next with that as well beyond COVID? So it gives you a little bit of a smattering of what we're doing, but it's a pretty broad look. And we're not a diagnostic company, meaning we don't sell point of care diagnostics, but we're looking for companion diagnostics, at home diagnostics, things like that can really help advance healthcare. So hopefully that gives you an overview.
Yeah, I think that brings up the whole idea that diagnostics is not just in the laboratory anymore. And COVID has really driven it further than anybody could have thought. And as Jenny said, that you can't avoid talking about the impact of COVID on diagnostic testing for the future. And, there was an exciting company that came out of Gene Expression, which is using saliva for diagnosing COVID, which is using RNA. And there's so much RNA in saliva that it opens up that whole area for interrogation for cancer and cancer companion drugs. If and therapeutics are moving more into specialties therapeutics and individualized therapeutics. So you're going to meet more diagnostics in that area. You want to speak a little bit about that, any of the panelists? Jenny?
Well, there's a lot in there to unpack, but something that I was really intrigued by Stephen's comment, and you just mentioned, Nola, is the companion diagnostics piece. And that may take us away from COVID, but I'm okay with that. So I'm curious about how the environment for developing and bringing companion diagnostics to market is changing. Historically, it's been tough to bring companion diagnostics to market. And it seems like that might be shifting, even just for you to have mentioned it from the pharma perspective. Stephen suggests, there's kind of more appetite from the pharma world for companion DX, and maybe that's true for regulators and payers as well. We're certainly seeing our very early stage companies having successful engagement with pharma in being part of clinical trials, at least as biomarkers. Big question mark whether that becomes companion diagnostics. I'd love the other folks on the panel and Nola, you as well, to talk about what we're seeing changing there and how that might be relevant to some of our startups in the audience.
Josh, you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think this falls into a category for us of how does one get paid for your test? And I think companion diagnostics for us, in some ways, you're sort of taking two risks. You're taking the risk of the company that's developing the diagnostic, and you're also taking the risk of the drug that it is accompanying. Because if the drug doesn't work, there's no need for your test. So that would sort of put us in a category of a company that maybe has multiple programs with multiple different pharmas doing multiple companion diagnostics, which is not something that we have sort of gravitated towards. But that's the way, as I think about how we get paid, which I think is one of the biggest problems in diagnostics,
right.
If not the biggest problem is how does anyone get paid? That's a way that mechanism can work. But independent of that, if you have a test, whether it's a point of care test or a CLIA test, how you actually get paid for that is really, really important and quite difficult in this market, and I think is one of the biggest problems we have. But specifically around that, I think the type of company that is required at least from our perspective, to invest in that would be doing these companion diagnostics might be something like Jenny's company, that is a new technology that opens up a new way of doing things that might be applicable to a number of different companies in a new way. And I think that can be, clearly that's a little bit different investment thesis for what we go after, which is what is the specific problem we're trying to solve clinically, and how does this solve it?
And you brought up a good point, Josh, about reimbursement and how do we get paid? And do you have a code at the beginning, or do you have a pull through from the consumer at the end? And what's your thought on that, Steve?
Yeah, it's less of my expertise, to be honest with you, but I'm more about looking for those technologies that can really move the needle and unlock some new insights or some new pathways for us to find drug targets or detect early. That's more what I'm focusing on. But I bet the other panels might have some better comments on the payee part of it. But I don't know, Josh, if you want to weigh in on that one.
I'm happy to elaborate a little on that. As again, the types of things that we're looking for, when you actually develop this test and you now want to bring it to market, there's really three sources of payment. There are potentially self-pay, which are very few markets are going to have a test that is compelling enough for people to pay out of pocket. That's just really, really difficult. Potentially it fits into the workflow of a provider into a procedure where they can save money on a particular procedure. So by using your test, maybe they avoid, some other procedures that are bundled and they save money. But the real one here at the end of the day is convincing the payers. It'd be fascinating one of these times to have a payer on this panel, because they're not going to pay until, and this is what we have found and what makes this very difficult, they're not going to pay until you can prove both the clinical utility and the economic utility of the test. And so what this does is it takes companies that have developed these great technologies, these great tests that can diagnose something that is going to have value. But until you run the big randomized controlled trial, probably 2 of them, and publish them, you're not going to get anybody to pay for it. It's a long process to do. And that's where we find, these companies fall down. It's just the economic burden of doing, our company, Sarah, has done multiple 5,000 patient randomized trials. That's what it takes to get payers to believe the data to incorporate these tests. So it's a real problem in where we see, and that's been choking a lot of the early stage companies, is people are just not willing to invest because they see this big problem at the end of the day. Yes, we're finally successful in getting this test validated, but you know what? No one's going to pay for it. And so that's why when we're looking at this, for us at least, the key is really, it's got to be so compelling with this clinical utility and the economic value that we're going to be able to get across that hurdle, get across that chasm. We're going to be able to attract the investment dollars because it's a big enough problem and a clear enough solution, and we can model it and we can show it and we can get people to believe it, and it's hard to do. So I think that's a real problem. It's how we get paid in this space. I mean, you see companies like Verisight that take years and years and years and years to get coverage for Afirma, or our test now they bought from Allegro. It takes them years to get coverage and lots of capital. It's a tough one, and I don't particularly have the answer. So maybe somebody else does.
Well, it's probably why a lot of the biomarker experiments are done at a research level for a long time before they make it into a truly diagnostic product. And there's a borderline between diagnostics and research that starts off with a biomarker. And that diagnostic system then might make itself into a companion diagnostic to an imaging product like an ultrasound or a mammogram. And then you have that as a predicate to what's being paid for. We'll pay for a mammogram, we'll pay for an ultrasound, but we can also test for some precision medicine, part of what you're doing by testing your DNA, your RNA, your something, and give you more precision medicine. And that could be incorporated into the price of the overall exam. And I'm not sure how we do that, but I see that as a path forward, where you have something that you're already using, but you want to layer on some precision medicine on top of it. Because basically what diagnostics is doing right now is getting you more precision with your pregnancy tests. And, these doctors want that information,
I think they do, but
Patients
they
want
don't pay for it.
They don't pay for it. The patient needs it and wants it, but they're used to having somebody else pay for them for everything. So how does it get covered? So I think that opens up, we could almost have a reimbursement panel instead of a diagnostic panel, and get a totally different panelists on here, people from Anthem and Blue Cross and, the payers, and say, what are you going to do in the future to provide a safety for your patients now that we can give you more precise diagnostics? How are you going to do that?
Yeah, and again, I think that the system truly wants these things.
Yes.
I mean, we want more precision. The doctors want these tools. The patients want them. The payers want them. But in your example, if you're adding on to say mammography, well, that's not a high price test to begin with. And so where are we going to get more money? That element of precision that you're adding to that test is going to add a lot of cost, because mammography is a screening test that's done millions and millions of times. And so adding anything element of cost to that is going to be a huge driver. So you come back to, you really have to prove that that is going to have a really big impact on outcomes. So otherwise you can't get paid for it.
Well, in the case of mammography, if you have a suspicious lesion, you then have to get a biopsy. That costs money. What if you added on top of, in lieu of a biopsy, we first do this precision medicine diagnostic, and then if we think it's cancer, we'll go in and cut you,
I think this points to something we were talking about when we were prepping for the panel, which is, diagnostics is not one category.
Right.
Right. It's a very broad spectrum from, and this is not exhaustive, screening to confirmation to diagnosis to prognosis to treatment response to monitoring. Right? And the requirements at each of those stages are very different in terms of cost pressures. You were talking about, Nola. Sensitivity and specificity, other performance, frequency, turnaround time, accessibility, and that makes for a complex landscape, but also, at least from our perspective, a really exciting one, because companies who are being really thoughtful about where their technology solves a real problem within that spectrum, and what are the product requirements that meet those difficult and diverse needs of patient, clinician, payer, healthcare provider, that the whole diversity of stakeholders. It's a very complex puzzle to solve, but when you find a great niche, you can make a real difference, and as you say, hopefully get paid for it.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Because I'll even add that, clinical trial design, a lot of diagnostics we see go into our clinical group. Technologies come in, they go into our clinical group, who's looking at different ways to design trials, monitor patients, decentralized clinical trials, remote patient monitoring, all that stuff as well. So, there's a lot of utility here, I think, across the board.
It's interesting, Stephen, you bring up the clinical trial aspect of it. And one of the things we see is that, if you're doing a PMA trial for a medical device, I don't know much about pharma, so I won't go down that path. But our companies that are going after doing a pivotal trial for their PMA, you're trying to satisfy the FDA. And what we're in, at least in the lab developed tests in the CLIA world, the FDA doesn't have a say.
Right.
And so our clinical trials are actually a combination of clinical outcomes and economics. because the real deciding voice is the payer. So it's a very different way of approaching a clinical trial, and it's more economically angled than, again, your pivotal for your PMA is a clinical outcome in, whatever your endpoint is. And you're satisfying two different people here, two different entities. And with a device, you get a PMA, or perhaps with a drug and you have an indication, an IFU for it, and the FDA has blessed it. They've said this device does what you say it does in this IFU, and it does it effectively, and we approve it. No such body in the CLIA world. So again, our test Sarah, there's nobody that opines on whether or not this is validated. There's no authority that says yes, and therefore we should start to pay for it. The company has to prove that itself and prove the economics, which is a second level, but very different clinical trial. And it's a different way of having to think. We have companies doing both, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, this one's about economics. This one's about outcomes.
Right, right. And so we're really braving a new world in terms of the amount of tests that are done now in CLIA labs, and the amount of research that's using biomarkers that's staying in research longer because there isn't a diagnostic revenue stream, but it's actually very informative to an MD making a decision about cancer. Or, and I think cancer is a wonderful place to go, because it's probably the only area of medicine which is really more scientifically driven than than outcomes driven, because no two cancers are alike. No two patients respond to treatment alike. So they need more and more guidance as to what to do and how to do it, and what is actually the marker on top of this cancer that I can attack with the tools that I have in my tool bag. So it makes diagnostics into part of the therapy. And I think that's where you're going to get your money back. And I'm not quite exactly sure how we're going to do that with the regulatory body, but maybe we can ask Life Science Nation to put a whole regulatory body panel together and discuss that. But we're really about empowering early stage investments here at this panel. So maybe we can go back to the best way to catch a fish is to think like one. So how can an early stage scientist begin to think like you, an investor, and what should they understand about getting an investment into their breakthrough science?
Well, the first word I'll say is markets. Right? So I think that's one of the challenges for great innovators in this space and others, where you might have truly breakthrough technology, translating that into a product that customers want in a marketplace, whether that's research tools or diagnostics or somewhere on that spectrum, is what takes that from a technology to a company, right? And so I see a few questions about research versus diagnostic markets. I started Genoa because I'm interested in both. I think both are legitimate places to build companies, build products, and that there's a great tradition of companies beginning in research tools and having kind of breakthrough tools for the better analysis of biology. And then over time, as that kind of scientific information in the field gets mature, then the clinical applications of those can become more clear. Now that could be a long road. You look at companies like Illumina, they didn't start out clinical, but obviously are a big player there today. Other companies may be really clear that their highest and best application is to go straight for a clinical application or product based on their technology. So, all of that needs to be informed by what are the existing markets, how are markets developing, and what are the unmet needs that customers, whether they are researchers or clinicians or payers, are going to pay for today and in the future, and really thinking about a longer arc for the development of the company.
Perfectly wonderful comment. Thank you very much for that. Because I agree, it's not only the market, but if you look at what's happened with COVID, where there's a huge market need, the investment into early stage testing for diagnostics has been interesting. Having it come to market is even more, interesting in this last year and a half, because you have people that are really working on trying to solve a problem at the point of care, like before you get on a plane or before you go somewhere that you have to have a COVID test, and the different the ways that people are looking for the opportunity to do that. If they could have pay for it themselves. A lot of people are doing self-pay to get COVID tests now, which may drive people into the home market of maybe they should do that for also, sensitive areas such as sexually transmitted diseases in the home market. Pregnancy tests have certainly gone down to the home market, and they used to be the domain only of a physician in the physician's office. So I see a real pull through at the consumer level, and that goes to your point, Jenny, of market. How big is the market, and who's willing to pay for it? Because if it works, people will pay to find out if they have COVID now. That they will do that. So where's the marker for that? Where's the diagnostics for that? We're seeing a lot of things in that area.
But also, what does that market look like in 5 years? Right. So a cautionary tale around building business plans around a pandemic. So, I was part of a genomics company in the 2000s that received a really great support from government funding to deal with what was then an acute pressure around sort of the anthrax scares, right? And so we developed a platform for very sensitive detection of microbes and characterization thereof. How big is the market for anthrax detection today, right? It's kind of not there anymore. The procurement went away by the time people's products were ready. And some companies did a really nice job of pivoting from those programs into real clinical applications, like BioFire, for example, and kind of going after respiratory detection using those advanced platforms. I think we'll see that with COVID. In this case, it'll be more in the point of care probably area. But my question mark there is, what other applications really need in-home detection? There's a short list. I think you just listed it, Nola, and there's already great players there. So I think it's a tough argument to make for a startup today that they ought to be targeting COVID testing.
Yeah.
But I think the trend to consumers wanting to know what's going on with their health was there before COVID. I think the question to your point is, how much will they pay for what indications, and what will motivate them to spend their money to do a test at home? I think telemedicine now obviously has been accelerated with COVID. People are more comfortable doing that. These diagnostics might enable more of that. So the question is, to your point before, Jenny, it's about I think it's about the market, and what will the market tolerate as far as the cost of these diagnostics, which then might say that the technology you're going after might be to lower the cost of the diagnostic more than anything else. It may not be the most sensitive test ever. It might be getting the cost down and being able to scale it, right? So
and easy to use, and doesn't take up a lot of space in your cupboard.
Getting that cost per test down below a copay might be where your target is, right? So those are some of the things you have to think about. But I think consumers do want to know more. And if you think about, I'm tracking my steps and all these different things for my sleep and whatever else, I want to know more about my health, and probably now more than ever with COVID. So if these tests were available, that's probably the question mark, is what tests would really motivate people to buy them and know what cost.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends that want to go to Hawaii, and in order to go, they pay $100 to get a test. So they can prove that they're COVID free to get on the plane. And then when they come home, they do the same thing so they can go back to work.
I think that part of the issue with COVID, at least what we see here, what I've experienced here in Massachusetts with high school age kids, and is the issues are very diverse. My kid can't go back to school without a negative test because she was playing basketball with somebody who was positive.
Mhm.
Well, it has to be a PCR test or my high school won't take her. So that means I've got to go find a PCR test that has a reasonable turnaround. And thank goodness we have the Broad Institute in Massachusetts, so we can, if you can actually get the test without having to wait 6 hours in line and then be turned away, you can get a result in 24 hours. Otherwise, it was 8 days to get a result. So what's the point of even having the test? She's already quarantined. So,
Right.
you know, it's in, so yes, going to Hawaii, on the other hand, you know, the Hawaii and airlines in the travel industry realize they won't have a business if they don't figure out a way to do it. So they put in a, you know, in these requirements to force it.
Mhm.
I think with COVID, it's just, you know, state by state, county by county, town by town, you know, and, you know, this rapid, if we could have a rapid test at home, that's great, but it doesn't matter because no one's going to accept the result
Yeah.
at this point. So
Yeah.
it's, we found, and I think, you know, Jenny's point was great, it's the time. We've had people come to us with COVID related businesses, whether it's in diagnostics or in devices. It's just like, by the time you develop this, you know, it's just, it's going to take too long. And existing companies that have the infrastructure and the ability to do this will beat us to that punch over and over and over again.
Yeah, in the chat, there's a rapidrona.com from Alexi that does home collection and door-to-door service for PCR right now. And we've also at Portfolio invested in a wellness company that also will deliver a home test for COVID. So what I'm seeing, even outside of the area of COVID, is that people are willing to do a lot more testing and giving of their samples for diagnostics from their home base and not going into a laboratory anymore. So I think that's a huge shift that's probably going to stick with us even after COVID, because it's just more convenient, and you're not exposing yourself to other people waiting in line to get a test for anything because you don't know what they have. But Jenny brought up a good point in our call about the multi-omics diagnostics. Is it a fantasy or reality? And I'd like to kind of explore that before we run out of time. Is it right around the corner, or is it decades away? Because, you know, if you look at Grail and Thrive and Illumina and what they did with their multi-omics platform, a lot of money went into that. A lot of valuation has been achieved by that, but I'm not exactly sure if that trend is going to continue. I do see people in the area of cancer wanting more information, because cancer is now a treatable disease, not the kiss of death that it used to be 30 years ago. Comments, question, you know, anybody?
Well, I think, you know, what Jenny was saying before, there were very different buckets along the way. So if it's screening is very different than, you know, monitoring treatments and everything in between. So I guess the question is, where do these fit in and where is the right place? If you're looking for much more precision guidance of therapies, then it's, you know, probably certainly post screening, probably post initial diagnostic. And there's an area there where now you have a very high value opportunity to get into the, you know, make a real significant difference in that particular patient's outcome. I question how some of these things could be applied in screening, where screening tests are, again, historically very inexpensive. Who gets them? How old do you have to be? What conditions? What qualifies me for a screening test versus others? Because they tend to be relatively low price because you have to apply them across such a wide population. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, if these big platforms can get their costs down to a point where screening becomes reality. So that would be something I'm interested in seeing in the future.
Yeah, well, so what is your futuristic outlook? How future oriented are you? How far out are you looking? in terms of where you invest. Steve?
Well, I think this goal of getting to a multi-omics approach, right, is the right aspirational goal, and I think that's not right around the corner. I think that's where we're at, right? I think the question though is, are there some steps along the way that can move the needle without getting to that all in? We understand every disease, we know the RNA, we know all the different omics that go into it. So these are the complex diseases, and I think the paradigm of one gene, one drug, one, that's where we're moving away from, right? We're moving to this complex kind of nature of the disease. So I think we're trying to look at it that way, like where's it going to go in the future, and we need to make investments in companies that are or technologies that can help us get there. And I think that's, I think some benefits could be around the corner, but I think the long-term goals could be decades away, to really go all the way to an omics-driven approach, right? That's not right around the corner. So yeah, no, we're looking at tech companies along the line that can add in, I mean, I think in each one of these different areas, like you look at microbiome or exposome, I don't think it's cracked yet, right? We don't know what the data really tells you and how to, but when you piece together these one by one, you start adding in more data points. I think that's where you can start making some informed decisions that can move the needle. So that's kind of my general answer to that one, but hopefully that helps.
Jenny, got any comments?
Yeah, maybe just a practical point that's hopefully of use to the innovators and the startups in the space, which is thinking about matching your funding needs, present and future, to the flavor of capital and its constraints and goals around timing, around your question, Nola.
Yeah.
So, just be aware that venture investors like myself have signed up for making, venture scale returns in the 7 to 10 year time frame. Like that is the tool of venture capital. Before I was at Geno, I was at the Gates Foundation, and part of the reason I went there was because the time frames were 30 and 40 years. We're going to eradicate malaria. It's not going to happen in the 7 to 10 year time frame. And so the capital was more patient in that sense. It was willing to go earlier around more breakthrough opportunities. Government financing like SBIRs, I think, are a really important way to fill in some of those capital needs, kind of pre-venture. Companies like J&J may exist on a spectrum themselves. I wouldn't speak necessarily for J&J, but just knowing that in some cases they may have a near-term corporate priority where they need something to get to market now versus, we've got a long-term theme, say in microbiome, where we need to be learning. So if you're pitching and you're thinking about, financing your business today, in a couple of years, in 5 years, thinking about the time frame that you're on and talking to the capital that matches that. Don't let our constraints be your problem. Like, talk to the people who have capital that matches what you want to do. Venture certainly isn't the end all and be all of financing.
So well said, Jenny. Thank you so much. Because, the idea of the venture capitalist making a return on their investment in the 7 to 10 year time frame is real. And the Gates is a perfect example of somebody without that kind of constraint. And the SBIR grants are always non-dilutive and always welcome alongside of a venture investment. And certainly that is a good use of taxpayer money to accelerate science as we know it today. And I think it fits very well into anybody in the research market that's doing research tools to go after some of that money from the NIH and the SBIRs and the NIST of the world. And it's cumulative how much money you pour at a problem and how much science you get. But the real elephant in the room these days is the AI application on top of all the data that you're getting. And that's really where tech meets bio. And how you analyze the data that you get from doing your mass spec analysis and what's going on under the curve, and how do you tweak that out to say, yes, I have an autism gene here. This person has autism. There's actually a genetic marker for it. Can anybody speak to the impact of AI and how you fold that into the diagnostic companies of today in a way that makes sense from a financial point of view or an outcomes point of view?
So I guess I'll take a shot at that. We are, we haven't found ourselves able to really understand the answer to that question, I guess is how I would put it. So we have not done an AI thing, because if you think of, I mean, AI can encompass lots of different things. You know, in some cases it could be, you know, a signature of proteins or genes that, you know, you've discovered, and you've worked through the trials and everything to really nail that down, and it's sort of fixed. So I would say that's like, you know, seroprognostics. We have a protein panel. We know what it is. It isn't changing. Yes, it was a lot of analysis to get to that point, to discover it and to nail it down. Is that AI? I don't really think of it as AI, but I guess maybe somebody could call it that. You know, I think of AI as a system that is learning and is adapting and changing over time. And I think the FDA has no idea how to deal with that. Because if the diagnostic I am using today is fundamentally different a year from now because somebody has used it and it's learned and changed itself, what is it? So we're kind of, if you think of how futuristic we are, we're not that futuristic. we're looking at today's problem, a solution for today's problem that makes sense. This is a little bit, at this point in time, beyond, from our standpoint, where we're willing to go.
And I think for us, we're on the earlier side of the continuum, clearly. I would say 90% of the companies I see have AI baked into it. It's being used, it's almost an enabler for a lot of technologies we're seeing. Yeah. You can imagine a lot of our digital biomarkers, I mean, they're all using AI. I even have a company in our GLS portfolio out of Boston that's looking at tissue slices and using AI to take the microscopic images and looking for motion in cells to predict which cells are cancerous cell by cell. So, I mean, that's only enabled by AI. You cannot do that real time without it. So I think it's an enabler that, from a diagnostic perspective, is part of the diagnostic itself. And then I think to your point before, Noah, like bringing it all together, that's another application for AI. When you bring all these data inputs together, all the omics, the information, everything else, that's another application for AI. So I think without that, and then image analysis obviously is another, you know, low-hanging fruit area for AI diagnostics that I think, you know, if you have self-driving cars, we can definitely help out with radiology type assessments and things like that to eliminate human error and things like that. So I think that's a rich area that's here and now. So these are areas I'm pretty excited about. So I see AI pervasive in probably 95% or so of what I look at. So.
Jenny, have any comments about that?
Well, the cynic in me, it's easy to take 95% of decks that companies are throwing your way and have them just like slap an AI gold sticker on the front. So I think we see a fair bit of that, which is, and we're AI, right? Which it doesn't always, it's not always relevant to what the company is doing. So it's gotten a little buzzy. But certainly AI, you know, thrives on very large data sets and uncertainty, which sounds like biology to me. So I think it's going to be increasingly relevant. But to Josh's point, it's easy to see why it's relevant in sort of learning and discovery. When we're talking about the delivery of healthcare, there's usually still, you know, a decade and $1 billion between learning and discovery and patient impact. Right. So it can be, I think, to Stephen's point, it becomes almost table stakes for doing work in that kind of environment as opposed to the product itself.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So just as individuals and as companies, do you have an established partner ecosystem for company development and making exits? Because as venture capitalists, we all need to exit the company at some point. J&J, do you guys have any partner system or thoughts of making exits? Josh, you obviously had some good exits with Boston Scientific. Do you talk to those guys all the time? How do you do that?
Yes, I mean, we do. I think it's probably, given where we invest, it's probably more developed on the device side than on the diagnostic side. There are just fewer large scale pure play diagnostic companies out there to be options. But yes, we do, we maintain dialogues with them. But very different acquirers for the companies that we've had. If you're playing more in the tools infrastructure place, maybe it's Illumina or Thermo Fisher or somebody like that. If you're on the content space, maybe it's LabCorp and Quest, but then it's a very different type of those types of folks. If it's a point of care, or if it's a kit, then maybe it's Abbott, maybe a J&J, but it's sort of, they all sort of play in different areas. And but yes, we do is the answer.
Steve?
Yeah, and for us, I mean, again, we're not a diagnostic per se company. So what I'm looking for for companies I bring in are companies that can make it into our pipeline, which means I'm looking for strategic fit with our existing businesses. So tools, diagnostics that can help advance the way we do clinical trials, help our pipeline, our existing products or products in development. Those are the type of diagnostics I'm really focusing on. And at-home diagnostics could be an area for consumer, or it could be something with our RX brands. We've got diagnostic companies that help medical devices as far as tracking wounds and injuries and healing at home and things like that. So those are the type of companies we're looking for. And then we hopefully do investments along the way, but we're really trying to feed our pipeline. That's really our goal.
Mm-hmm. And you have a specific pipeline already because you're Johnson & Johnson. You are one of those ecosystem people that people want to know. So how do people get in contact with you from other venture groups? Do they call you? Do they call Melinda? Who do they call?
I think they call all of us. I mean, I think we're positioned by design to be in where the innovation is happening. So in my ecosystem, hopefully, typically they call me, or they call some of our innovation center colleagues, or whoever we have connections with. And of course, we try to divide and conquer and build really strong relationships. But we want to be where that cool science is happening, where the trends are happening, where the healthcare solutions of the future are just budding, and that's where we want to be. So you could call any of us. We have our websites out there. We have a rolling admissions for J Labs. We try not to hide. We try to be very visible. So I would encourage anyone to reach out to any of us, and including myself, and I reach to the right people. Again, J&J is such a dynamic, large, complicated company that even I don't figure it out completely, and I'm here for 9 years. So I think let us be that red door and figure it out for you. So we'll help you in anywhere along the lines, from just an idea all the way to a company that's ready for a bigger deal. We're there to help you. So.
Well, that's great news, because I think all of us need to work together to make the future brighter and more successful for scientists coming up with the great ideas that they're coming up with the analysis that they're doing, with whatever they're doing it with computers are here to stay. But at the end of the day, the person that benefits the most is going to be the patient who stays healthy and doesn't get sick. And it's not actually a wellness factor, but it's a how to live in the world of bugs and critters that are out to get you and not get sick with them. And COVID is a perfect example of how we're navigating that world. And I always want to thank all of the panelists on behalf of Life Science Nation for being available today to talk and be a resource for the entrepreneurs in the audience. And thanks for being open and honest with your answers and very thoughtful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Noah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much, everyone. And this panel will be available for viewing on the live agenda. And also just a reminder to the audience, if you have more questions for these panelists, reach out to them through the partnering platform. I'm sure they'd be happy to discuss further. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys.